Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of In the Workplace. My name is April Yue. I am a research editor at the Institute for Public Relations Organizational Communication Research Center. Today, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Ganga Dhanesh join me. Ganga is an associate professor and associate dean in the College of Communication and Media Sciences at Zayed University in UAE. I appreciate you being here today, Ganga.
Thank you so much, April, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to share some of the insights from the study on remote internal crisis communication.
Awesome. Like Ganga said, she and her co-author discussed a very timely and important topic of internal communication in their recent publication, which is titled Remote Internal Crisis Communication, Role of Internal Communication in Predicting Employee Engagement During Remote Work in a Crisis. So Ganga, employee engagement is not a new concept to us. It has garnered a tremendous amount of attention in PR and especially in the field of internal communication. It has almost become a buzzword for many, many years. And we all know that one of the classic definitions of that is it refers to a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind that's kind of characterized by having vigor, dedication, and absorption. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the context in which you looked at employee engagement and what's the novelty here?
Great. So when my co-author, Dr. Gail Duttler, and I were wondering what kind of research to do during the pandemic, this topic really stood out for us because the context was actually quite unique, at least in our lifetimes, right? So it was a combination of facing a global health crisis, which had this domino effect on organizations, within organizations. And although this remote and teleworking had been around for quite a while, this was the time when employees across the world were thrust literally overnight en masse into remote working, and sometimes with hardly any preparation. So the amount of complexity and unfamiliarity that they were navigating were huge. Plus, of course, there were job-related anxieties due to potential economic fallout. People were losing jobs at the time. So there were multiple layers of anxieties that people were facing. And on top of all this, people were also disconnected from their workplaces and their colleagues, physically and socially distanced from their workspaces. And that also meant that there were no more water cooler conversations, there were no more grapevine and all of that. So the context was really very unique. How do organizations continue to maintain employee engagement in the traditional sense in this context? So we adopted Cohen's conceptualization and operationalization of employee engagement because it also added an element of social aspect of engagement, because the social connectedness was really what was being struck at during this time. So that definition measured intellectual, which is like cognitive, affective, and the social dimensions of engagement. So that was what was slightly different, because we were trying to see in this new context, how do you define engagement and how do you help organizations to continue to maintain employee engagement in such a context?
Great. Thank you so much for that nice quick review of your study context and also on employee engagement. My next question is, that you looked at the role of internal communication in increasing employee engagement in the remote working context. How did you define internal communication, and what aspects of internal communication did you look at?
So as you know, internal communication is a fairly broad concept and it has multiple aspects to it. However, given the context of the study, we did this really broad, wide-ranging review of literature across organizational comm, business studies, psychology, organizational psychology, and so on and so forth. And we found that although people had looked at a whole lot of things like communication content, communication direction, there was communication structure, formal, informal, communication media, the ones that were repeating the most were communication direction. I mean, it went by different names. People would call it employee voice, feedback, information from the supervisor. So essentially, it was about two-way flows of communication between the organization and its employees. So organizations not just had to give information, but they also had to listen because employees wanted to feel heard. So that was one. So the direction was one of the biggest aspects across all these bodies of literature in the context of remote employee engagement. Then the other one was internal crisis communication content. I mean, of course, that literature didn't call it internal crisis comm. Internal crisis comm is more to do with PR field, but information or the content kept cropping up across those bodies of literature as well. So we turned to internal crisis communication content and looked at the different types of communication that could go out, whether it was informative, something to do with enhancing identification with the organization, or just giving facts about the crisis. We also looked at internal crisis communication objectives. So what was this communication expected to do? Was it supposed to build a sense of security amongst the employees? Was it meant to strengthen a feeling of belongingness amongst them during these times? Or was it to activate behavior? I mean, here are things that you have to do to address the crisis. So while there are so many aspects to internal communication, we focused on these three aspects which kept repeating the most across these different bodies of literature, all of which had to do with remote employee engagement.
Right. I really like the idea of incorporating different aspects of internal communication in terms of the content of the communication, direction of it, and the even objective of the communication. It really gives us a comprehensive picture of what the internal communication looks like in such a context. Thank you so much. So my next question is on the sample that you collected for your study. Could you give us a quick overview or review of the participants in your study?
Yeah, sure. So what Gail and I had done was we approached the international market research company YouGov, and they recruited the sample for us from their research panel of employees from the United Arab Emirates. And the final set of participants had people from, UAE is a very diverse place. So we have almost, I think, 200 nationalities represented here. So we had people from across the Middle Eastern, North Africa region. We had India, Pakistan, and the criteria was anyone age 18 and above, working full-time in any industry, that didn't matter, but they should have been working remotely either at the time of the study or sometime within the past 2 months. So we got people who had experience of remote working from here. And finally, we had about 304 participants with about 60% men and 40% women.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So before we dive into some of the key findings, I have another question on a concept you measured in your study called new ways of working. Could you give us some examples of what that is, what that means, and how are new ways of working connected with employee engagement in your study?
Sure. So new ways of working is actually defined as a work design in which employees can control the timing and place of their work while being supported by electronic communication. That simply means that employees can choose where they work, when they work, and what comm technology or comm media they can use for their work. Now, this is slightly different from the traditional definition of flexibility or flexible working, which usually talks about where, when, and which task you want to focus on. So this one is where, when, and which media. And that made more sense because everyone was working remotely. So the three dimensions in which NWW has been operationalized as obviously being temporal flexibility, spatial flexibility, and control over communication media. Now, how can it, so that can mean anything. That is what almost all of us were doing, right? Whether we were using Zoom or MS Teams, choosing whether to work from the bedroom or the kitchen, because, well, I guess we didn't have more choice than within the home at a certain point in time, and when. Now, how does it foster employee engagement? Usually through more autonomy, because you have the ability to choose and you have so much more control over the when, where, and what media. You're more accessible. So there's increased accessibility, there's increased connectivity. So in those ways, new ways of working can enhance employee engagement. But on the flip side, it can also negatively affect employee engagement through, obviously, through work-life conflict, interruptions at work, and this whole thing of being always on, right? There's really isn't any cutoff point. And of course, there's reduced social support and feedback. So while it can enhance engage, so it's like a double-edged sword. It can enhance and it can take away from employee engagement both. And another aspect that kept coming throughout the literature on new ways of working was the importance of social connections. So we needed technologies that could help to foster that sense of social connectedness, without which it was challenging to keep people engaged over remote work.
Right. Well, thank you so much for explaining how it can be both a pro and con. And I really can't wait to dive into the findings. So what did you find out to be some of the predictors of employee engagement? What's working, what's not?
So this was really very revealing to us, because individually, all of them predicted employee engagement, two-way flows of communication, information, content, objectives, and new ways of working. But when we considered all of them together in conjunction, the ones that stood out the most were two-way communication and internal crisis communication content, particularly identification. So what that meant was, how much ever new ways of working, how much ever the latest technologies you give people, if you want to keep them engaged while they're working remotely in a crisis context, what you need the most are these two-way flows of communication. Employees want to be heard. I mean, they're racked with a lot of crises and a lot of anxieties, and they want to be heard. They want the organization to create those opportunities and avenues where they can share their concerns, have a feeling that they're being heard, in addition to obviously getting information from the organization, particularly to do with identification. So they want to be able to identify with the organization, feel a sense of belonging, and things like that. So organizations need to give content that can strengthen trust and identification in the organization.
Great. Yeah, you sort of mentioned some of the suggestions and advice. But if I were the communication director of a company that's having some trouble keeping employees engaged during remote work, what key advice or other additional advice can I suggest to my leaders or organizations to increase employees' engagement level?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think particularly when they're away from their physical workspaces, when they are disconnected from their colleagues, the most important thing to ensure is that there are channels for two-way communication.
Right.
And most importantly, even when you're offering them the latest and the best communication technologies, it needs to have affordances that will enable social connection, right? So whatever you're doing, so instead of email, you might want to have video calls. You might want to have, after we did this survey, we did a study, which was a qualitative study, and interviewed a lot of companies. And this again came out very strongly that they had these kind of coffee chats. They had informal sessions where they would just catch up with employees. There's nothing on the agenda. So a lot of the companies which were on best employer lists did that. They created the sense of being socially connected, even when they are physically distanced over remote modes of work. So that would be one, that in addition to giving those two-way channels, you have to choose technologies that will strengthen social connections amongst employees. I think that would be two of the most important recommendations. And also, I was just reading somewhere about the term perma-crisis, which has become the Collins Dictionary Word of the Year for 2022, wow. Which is a portmanteau, obviously, of permanent and crisis. So it's like this world where we are in a constant state of lurching from one uncertain crisis to another, and you're not sure what's going to come around the corner. And I mean, is it a war? Is it a pandemic? Is it something else? So you're constantly in a state of readiness. So although we did this study while we were going through the pandemic, I think that practitioners can take from this for the future, which could be a state of perma-crisis, or at least what we have been calling a VUCA world, that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So in such a context, and with so much of conversation going on about continuing with remote work, or at least hybrid modes of work, I think findings from this study can stand practitioners in good stead going forward as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that excellent advice. And Ganga, really thank you very much for your time and insights. I appreciate you being here today and for your contribution to OCRC. To our audience, thank you as well for tuning in. I hope to see you in our next episode.